Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
The debate over abortion in America has known a number of venues. 17 years ago this week, Roe v. Wade made it a constitutional issue to be waged before the Supreme Court. Then last year, the Missouri case, the Webster case, threw it back into the state capitals of the 50 states, where now, even in Indiana, the battle is being waged over the details of when you allow abortion and when you do not. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about the current state of abortion in these United States and where it's headed in our various legislatures. Our panelists are John Rouse, producer of this program and a member of Ball State's political science faculty; Loretta Kieran, president of the Delaware County Right to Life; Sue Waniger, president of the Board of Directors of Planned Parenthood of East Central Indiana; and Angie Cooksey from Ball State's Philosophy Department. John, this was a constitutional issue, and now it's very much a state issue, as we see in the halls of the legislature in Indianapolis.
Yes, see, for 17 years, as you say, it was a constitutional issue. It was a constitutional issue in the sense that a woman had a right to an abortion. It is no longer a constitutional issue, it is a political issue. A political issue is something that will be decided, of course, in politics. So it may be a question in terms of, is it a partisan political issue or is it a policy issue? It's certainly not a policy issue yet, because the policies have not been established, at least in this state. And it's not a systems issue because it has not been put into the bureaucratic system of enforcing a particular law. So there's some question in terms of where the partisans stand on this issue, Republicans and Democrats. But without question, it is a political issue.
Loretta, Pat Robertson, one of the more prominent spokesmen for the pro-life movement, said this week that we'll come back to Washington, and we'll come back, and we'll come back, and we'll come back until we win this battle. Is this a battle that can be won?
Yes, I think it can. It may take some time. It may come sooner or later. But I think just like you had the abolitionist movement, it's the same type of an issue. So we can look back in history and see what happened in that issue and see how, and it's going that way in this one.
Do you put any stock in various polls, including one done by the Indianapolis Star recently, that show that somewhere between a third to more than half of the people have more liberal views on abortion than the Right to Life movement?
Now, I don't really take too much stock in polls because we all know that it depends on the question and how it's led, so it can be changed. In other words, I could go out and do the same poll and just ask the questions a little bit different and come up probably with a different answer. I think what I'm more interested in is like a survey of registered voters, because Larry's quite right, and John's quite right, that it is going into the political arena, and I think what's more important is to see how the registered voters feel, and we have done some surveys in that area, so we know approximately how it's going.
Sue, the Indianapolis Star poll would seem, even in conservative Midwestern Indiana, lend some credence to the pro-choice movement.
I think that's definitely true. Also, the Amos poll, in conjunction with this poll, also support the viewpoint of the choice majority that, for the most part, the choice needs to be left to the woman and her doctor. There are a number of people on either end of the spectrum. Some people who believe that abortion should be available under every and all circumstances and probably should be paid for by the government, and those on the other end of the spectrum who believe abortion should be unavailable under any circumstances. Those figures vary anywhere between 9 and 12% on either end of the spectrum, with most people falling someplace in the middle. As far as it being a political issue, I think it's very true that it is. For the last 17 years, the people who have been voting on this single issue have tended to be the people in the Right to Life movement, who have, because the people who have pro-choice views have been protected by Roe v. Wade, in that it wasn't actually something they had to vote on. I think you're going to see more people voting in the upcoming November elections on this issue than ever before, as we have seen already in some states.
And there's obviously a deep philosophical difference between the pro-lifers and the pro-choicers. My question to Loretta would seem to be one that maybe we can't answer. Will there ever be a national consensus on this issue?
I don't know. It's a good question. The issue is one that is completely cloaked in emotionality. It tends to be an issue that polarizes people. The middle ground is difficult to find when you're talking about an issue as complex as abortion. I think that more than anything else, what we might need as voters, as the general public, is more education about what the issue really entails. We need to begin to ask ourselves some questions about Roe versus Wade and to begin to look at what that case really is about. It may or may not be about right to life. It may or may not be about fetuses and a mother's autonomy over her body. But what it certainly is about is the right to privacy. The right to privacy is that, of course, in which the choice rests itself. So I think that if the public's going to come to a greater understanding, they need to take a look at what is the central issue in Roe versus Wade in this entire discussion itself.
You know, I think that the issue is moral behavior and how do we get every citizen to be moral. And the problem here, or the problematic question, is that what a legislature does is the result of interest groups and power politics, not necessarily moral behavior. So is not moral behavior not going to come back to the citizen on any issue, whether it's this issue or some other issue, and it's going to be the responsibility of the individual to practice moral behavior. Can we legislate moral behavior?
Is that the question, Loretta? Can we legislate moral behavior, or is it a moral issue?
It's a moral issue as far as individuals deciding on how they're going to react to the issue. But I think we need to zero in more on the fact that it's a civil rights issue. This is something in our country we've always felt strongly about justice and so forth, and I think this is the real area. Yes, morals do come into it, but it's not the primary. Is America going to protect all of its citizens, no matter how little or how strong, how weak, or how old? We need to protect them all.
You talk about the rights of the unborn.
Yes.
But those legal rights have not been recognized in large part by the courts.
Just in the last few years. I mean, they were recognized for 2 centuries up until that Supreme Court ruling. And we mustn't forget that that was just 7 justices who wiped out every state law across the boards, even those that were pro-abortion. It kind of negated them all. So for 200 years it was illegal, and their rights were protected.
How do you want this issue handled, Sue? Do you want the Supreme Court to deal with it, or should we be fighting in each of the 50 states over legislation for each individual state?
I personally believe in the right guaranteed by the Constitution of privacy, and that the right to privacy guarantees the right for a woman to choose an abortion. One thing I think you also have to understand is that the first laws that came on the books in this country that dealt with abortion were in the 1800s. As this country was founded, the position on abortion had to do with English common law, which recognized a fetal right as of quickening, which is when the mother can feel the movement of the child, and treated only as a criminal act or something that was the state had a right to interfere in only after quickening. And it was only in the middle of the 18th century that laws began to be enacted in this country dealing with abortion.
It's not really, is it? Well, or is it? Is it a medical question we're arguing here?
Well, I think that a part of what I might argue is that to begin to clear the issue. Even if we allow that the fetus is a person and we allow that the mother is a person, that does not address the abortion question. Because in a society where justice is pursued, where everyone is guaranteed a right to life, you're always going to then invite competition of interests. I think more what this issue is about is how to grade and weigh the interest of the fetus against the interest of the mother. And there are various codes and various rules that we might follow in weighing those interests, but I think that might be a point of clarification that needs to be made. It may not be so much putting this burden on man to determine whether or not that fetus is a person, even if we allow that from the onset. That doesn't address the problem. We still, as moral beings working within a legal system, must determine how morality and law may complement each other, so we learn how to best let these interests coexist peacefully.
You know, I don't think anybody is really getting at the question I'm trying to ask, because we're all dancing around this. The issue is morality. And if we're going to leave morality on any issue up to a group of politicians and bureaucrats, morality is in one big trouble. My issue is this is a wonderful opportunity for us to try to educate. And it's a wonderful opportunity for the state legislature to educate. There are other issues, for example, besides abortion that contribute to abortion. You have issues of child care. That's been a child abuse, sex education. Even the focus upon the role of women in society, the attitude of males towards women. And no one is educating. I mean, our leaders don't want to educate. There's more to the issue of abortion. And I'm asking the question again, who is going to be the person to enforce morality? It really has to come down to the individual person. Again, if we leave the issue of morality up to the politicians and the bureaucrats, are we as a citizenry not already in deep trouble?
If you look at the development of jurisprudential thought, it is clear that law initially grows out of various moral codes, but there came a point in the 19th century where law grew distinct from morality and the drafting of ethical codes. Law began to deal in pedantry that ethics had nothing to do with. Conversely, ethics tended to emphasize conscience and guilt, where law began to deal in detail and manipulation of information. I agree with John. It's dangerous to argue from a pollstar standpoint that we want politicians to become drafters of our ethical codes. But I think what we're seeing in 1990 and what we've been seeing for the past 20 years is a shift in how ethical information becomes delivered to people and how it is they go about processing that. Is it the schools? Is it the family? We put a lot of responsibility on the individual, but we all know that becoming an individual who can make a decision is difficult. I might just reiterate the question then and pose it to Sue and see, where is that responsibility going to fall?
The responsibility for education and moral issues?
Delineating some ethical guidelines that young people may follow, reaching all the way back to sex education. Some of these issues John has brought up.
Yeah, and I mean, there are also issues like prenatal care. I mean, how about the issue of rape and incest, adoption, affirmative action, sex education, as I said a few minutes ago? All of these issues are current issues in society, and they do have some sort of impact upon the incidence of abortion.
Part of the problem, as I see it, is in the past few number of years, what we've been doing is telling people that morality must be categorized behind closed doors. And so we've been telling kids separation of church and state kind of idea, which then evolved into separating morality from law, morality from behavior. And unless we get that idea back in, that we are moral in our everyday lives, no matter what careers or whether we're a politician or whether we're a doctor or what we are, we have to get morality back into our own private lives. And until we do that, and I don't see how we can do that unless we get the state out of doing the reverse. In other words, the state started to say, well, no, you have to separate. Unless we get them out and allow them, and have them allow us to get that back into our everyday lives out in the public, you're not going to change that.
But don't you feel uncomfortable with to go to the biblical kind of example and say that you want Caesar to do God's work? I mean, that's a pretty heavy trip, isn't it?
Because Caesar is us. In America, Caesar is us. And so we set the trends. So as our society deteriorates in its moral behavior, we see our leaders deteriorating. So we have things like the mayor of Washington, D.C. We have all kinds of problems happening with our political leaders. And it's not just them, it's us too. Do you see what I mean? It reflects. What they're doing reflects on what we're doing, and what we're doing reflects on what they're doing. So we can't just say we want our leaders to get morality back in. We have to do it ourselves as well.
The Right to Life movement, in terms of practical politics, you look at this poll, and you might say the Indianapolis Star poll, although they'll argue it's scientific, shows that fewer than 10% of the people, at least in Indiana, fewer than 10% don't want abortion under any circumstances, which means there are more than 90% of the people would allow it in some situations. From a practical political standpoint, doesn't the Right to Life movement have to change its position somewhat?
No, the abolitionists didn't. Again, I know that some people don't like going back to that, but it's the only example we have in history which shows us how do American people and how does it work in America. And back then, we had the same problem. We had a lot of people saying, and in the discussions in the political arena and in the printed media and so forth, they got around the one idea that does an individual have the right to choose to own a slave or not to choose to own a slave, to choose not to? And they had the whole question evolve around that. But yet the abolitionist and the slave himself said, you're missing the whole point. That's not the point. The point is, I am a human being. I have the right to my life and my liberty. And so you saw all of the political agenda going on, even up into the Missouri Compromise, where some states could come in free, some could come in slave, to try to avoid the issue.
That's a terrible example. The variables are completely different.
No, they're not. They're exactly
Well, they really
the same.
are, because in freeing that slave, you're not making an imposition on another human being who also has
The
interests.
slave owner would not have agreed on that.
But
He
the
had an
slave-
economic,
but the
his whole way
slave
of
owner-
life depended on
No,
that
but the
system.
slave owner on a one-on-one individual interest in right to life to individual interest in right to life would not have had the same kind of physiological concern, emotional concern that the mother has in regard to that unborn fetus.
Well, I don't think the slave owner
I don't
would
think
look
you
at it
can
like
argue
that.
that analogy to its fruition. But even if we grant that everybody has the right to life, how does this organization and this organization respond to the competition of interests between people in a free society? That fetus is a person, the mother is a person. How ought we morally respond to the competition between the interests of those two?
Well, are you looking at the right to life of a fetus versus the inconvenience of the mother? Is
Or
that
maybe
what it's
the
going
right to life of the mother. Even in a society.
We have no objections to both the mother and the baby's life being protected to its utmost. But I don't think we're really talking about the mother's life here, because there's no difference of opinion between us on that point.
Except the right to life issue says there should be abortion allowed in no issue whatsoever, in no circumstance whatsoever.
No, except to save the life of the mother. We have that exception.
Well, I think the poll breaks down something like this. 47% believe that there should be no abortion except for incest or rape, and about 49%, something like that, believe that the issue of abortion should be left up to the woman and her doctor. But even if you take the issue of slavery and blacks, I mean, it's a pretty serious kind of situation for black Americans when they had to have the government to come in to force whites to be fair to them. And we have a whole history of how government attempted to try to make whites be fair to blacks. Again, the morality for us to be fair to blacks has to come from inside ourselves, as well as having people force us to behave in certain kinds of ways.
From the people, which is
We've been talking about the issue of abortion at least for 17 years. Of course, abortion was occurring a long time before that. But the question is, how do we raise different questions on this, because we seem to be circling the bush? And the issue is morality, and how are we going to be more moral people? And do we have Caesar, the government, to come into our bedrooms or into our homes and tell us how to be moral? Morality is in one heck of a deep problem, as I've said.
Of course, it depends on how you define morality, too. The set of laws that we have in this country, in this state, are based on, I mean, Angie's talked about what laws are based on, but any law defines some moral code. The law on murder, law on burglary, on theft.
Well, some, but once again, there is a point at which law departs from what might be called primal inclinations toward morality. Law began to deal in detail and began to employ something called the ordinary man standard, began to use criteria. Substantive due process has very little to do with moral and ethical reasoning. It has much more to do with formal logic. So there does come a point where law and morality split, and the gulf between them is troublesome, especially when the people come before the law with an issue that's tainted in moral connotation. Such was the case when Jane Roe, the fictitious character, brings this case before the Texas Supreme Court. The problem wasn't that the government wanted to deal in this issue. The problem was that the issue was brought to the government. The Supreme Court probably would have rather not dealt at all with this decision of Roe versus Wade, but when forced to make the decision, did as little as it could possibly get by with. Blackmun admits it himself in the decision. He says if theologians and philosophers and learned men can't determine when life begins, who are we, the men of the court, to decide this? So what did they do? They put it back in the laps of the state. I don't agree that the state's only been involved in this issue recently. The state's been involved for 17 years in the notions of second and third trimester abortions and the notion of state interest. What repealing Roe Wade threatens to do is to put more power in the hands of the state, thus creating a political arena, thus beginning to ask the question again, who will legislate morality? Is that really what we want to come to?
It's certainly not what I want to come to. It's very hard for me to believe that in this day and age we would want people in Indianapolis or even people in Washington to make moral decisions for us. I think that's those of us who are religious people. We have a basis in our belief in God and whatever church we attend, and it goes back in through our family and how we behave as ethical, moral human beings. I don't think we want the state infringing on that and saying this is the moral code, most especially if it is a specific belief or moral code for one segment of a religious population within this country, which unfortunately on this particular issue it is, especially if you talk about when life begins and trying to intrude the life begins at conception argument into any state statute. That is not a universally held belief among religious groups.
But that's where the whole question hinges, and that's where it's going to be answered. And until people realize that it has to be answered in just that exact arena, we're going to see more chaos and more problems in this country.
I agree.
You must address, when does life begin? It's either dead and non-existent or it's alive. And if it's alive, what species is it? Is it human? Then under our Constitution, that right to life must be protected if that human life is in existence. I'm with you. I don't want the government to legislate my morality. I'm married. I don't want it to tell me whether or not I must remain faithful to my husband or not. If I want to go and sleep with somebody else, fine. But once that human life begins, you now have somebody else's life at stake. It's not just my choices then. And I think that goes into other areas. In other words, if I want to rob a bank, I guess I can do it. And if I want to take a gun in when I rob the bank, I guess I can do that too. But I'm sure glad I've got a government there that says, but I say you can't, because I have other citizens in this country to protect besides you. And those must be protected as well.
Competition of interests. Now, what do we do in looking at the competition of interests if we grant that every fetus has the right to life and ought be able to continue with the process and move through gestation and become an infant? Do you see society as being in great need of an abundance of infants? Because what we're essentially saying, going back to John's issue of child care and the problems associated with that, if it would be the case that every fetus became an infant and every infant became a person in this country, I think in not too long at all would be suffering great problems economically, managerially, financially. I mean, we have to deal with that. Right. What would the world look like if that were the scenario? Then what would the competition of interest be? Then you might be talking about the interest of the fetus against the interest of society. I think that's been a compelling notion in China for a while.
If I could say, I want to ask both of you the question in terms of, why don't you form a coalition? Pro-choice and pro-life form a coalition in the political arena to fight for more funding for child care, right. to fight for education in terms of child abuse, birth control, prenatal care we know is of tremendous concern, especially in Indianapolis. Why don't you form a coalition to fight for life, not just the beginning of life, but life? I mean, I'm talking about life. I'm talking about women's lives.
You brought up birth control, though. A large, I mean, obviously the pro-life movement has a lot of its impetus from the Catholic Church, and you're going to find a real problem there selling birth control.
No, that's not exactly true. Because I'm Catholic, and I agree with my church on that point. But I'm also in the Right to Life movement. And I agree as well to stay out of that issue because that is a legitimate choice in this country for a woman. I may not agree with it, but there is no other human life in existence yet when you're talking about legitimate birth control. Therefore, even though I may not agree with it, I do defend her right to be able to choose that.
But if the polls are correct, and Catholics are having 31% of the abortions in this country, is it not incumbent upon the Catholic Church to teach birth control?
No.
Otherwise, you end up with the possibility of abortion.
No, it's incumbent upon her to teach her own doctrine better to her followers.
Well, I'm just asking.
I don't see that.
Okay. But again, where is the coalition in terms of these other issues of life? I mean, once the child gets here, you don't want the child abused. You want child care because what has happened in our society is that the economic position of women has changed in the last 20 years. Women have gone into the marketplace, and there's something other than rearing children and also providing care. Women are no longer solely care providers and people who raise children.
Is there a middle ground where you can meet?
I don't know that there's a middle ground as far as I'm concerned. If we're talking about educating people as to moral positions, I have no difficulty whatsoever with any person who chooses.
We're out of time. We have difficulty with that. John Rouse, Loretta Karen, Sue Weininger, Angie Cooksey, thank you for being with us. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
Public Affairs Roundtable is produced in the studios of WIPB Channel 49 on the campus of Ball State University. The producer is John Rouse. Listener comments are welcome.